Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and go over our PowerPoint presentation over chapter 4 from Creswell. I'm going to not show my video on this because it blocks out the words on the slide, and so just know that that's why. So chapter 4, specifying a purpose and research questions or hypothesis. In chapter 2, we identified a research problem. Statement of the problem 2.3 assignment that you did for our research proposal. In this chapter, we're going to learn how to specify the research purpose, research questions, or hypothesis. Remember, the research problems are different from the purpose or intent of the study. The research purpose is located in the purpose statement section. The research purpose is used to address the problem of the study. Think, we have a problem. That's the first thing to realize. Now, what are we going to do about it? That's the purpose or intent of the study. Number 1, you identify a problem. Number 2, create a solution. That's your purpose to drive the study. Here's an example. A research problem could be a lack of students enrolled in online classes. So the purpose statement would be to study why students do not enroll in online classes at community college. The purpose addresses the problem. Creating the purpose statement, research questions, and hypothesis will provide critical information to readers about the direction of the study. They also raise questions that the research will answer through the data collection process. We are going to learn how to write these for both qualitative and quantitative research. There are 4 terms used in research to convey the intent of the study. Number 1, purpose statement. Number 2, research questions. Number 3, hypothesis. Number 4, research objectives. These terms vary in their intent, their role in research, their form or their appearance in studies, their use or their application in quantitative and qualitative approaches, and placement in research, which is their location. The purpose statement advances the overall direction or focus of the study. Researchers state the purpose statement in one or more sentences. It is used in both quantitative and qualitative research studies and typically located in the statement of the problem section. It often appears as the last sentence of an introduction. It usually begins as such: the purpose of this study is. The above is an example of a quantitative purpose statement addressing teacher communications and student achievement. A qualitative example could be: the purpose of this study is to explore parent stories regarding internet communications with teachers about their students in one Midwestern school district. Research questions in both quantitative and qualitative research narrow the purpose statement to specific questions that researchers seek to answer. They are created before the method of the study is developed. Type of data to be collected and analyzed. There are usually multiple research questions in order to fully explore a topic. The research questions are in both quantitative and qualitative research. In quantitative research, the questions relate variables, attributes, or characteristics of individuals or organizations. More about variables later. In qualitative research, the questions include a central concept that is to be explored, which we will learn is called the central phenomenon. The research questions are typically at the end of the statement of the problem section or right after the literature review. Those are your related variables. The first example above is a quantitative research question. The second example is a qualitative research question, which is open-ended. Hypotheses are statements in quantitative research where the researcher makes a prediction regarding the outcome of a relationship among the variables, or your attributes or characteristics. Hypotheses narrow down the purpose statement to specific predictions. These predictions are not educated guesses like we used to do with the scientific method and experiments. Instead, hypotheses are based on results from past literature that has been synthesized and investigators can now offer predictions of what new researchers will find when the study is duplicated with new people or locations. These hypotheses are located at the beginning of the study, usually at the end of the introduction section. They are usually placed after the literature review in a separate section titled Hypothesis. Usually, several hypotheses are created. Above is an example of an hypothesis. Research objectives are statements of intent used in quantitative research that specifies the goals that the researcher plans to achieve in a study. They are then subdivided into major and minor objectives. They are found often in survey and questionnaire studies or in evaluation research where the investigator has identified objectives. These are also found at the end of the statement of the problem section, after the literature review, or in its own separate section. To identify objectives within a study, look for the statement starting like, the objectives in this study are. The above is an example of a research objective. Research objectives are not frequently used in research. For this chapter, we will focus primarily on hypothesis and research questions as a method to narrow and focus our purpose statements. Purpose statements and research questions are important because they act as signposts for your research. Without them, your reader would be lost throughout your study. They would provide key components to understand the results of the study. Good research links the purpose statement and questions to the major results or findings. To write quantitative purpose statements, research questions, and hypotheses, you need to understand variables, importance, and use. Variables are characteristics or attributes of an individual organization that is A, measurable and or observable, B, varies among individuals or organizations. They are key ideas researchers seek to gather information on to address the purpose of their study. Here's an illustration that you can look at for a variable and how it can be measured and how it varies among individuals. Remember that a variable is a characteristic or attribute or their personal attributes of a person, such as their gender, their grade level, their age, or income level. You can measure these attributes in a study. Let's consider what it means to measure an attribute. Measurement means that the researcher records information from individuals in one of two ways. Number one, ask them to answer questions on a questionnaire, or number two, you can observe them and record their scores on a log or a checklist. In either case, the student scores will probably vary from each other, hence the term variable. When variables vary, it means that scores will be different in value, dependent upon the type of variable being measured. For example, gender will vary by two possible scores. Female equals 2, a score of 2, and male would be a score of 1. When a participant completes a question, the researcher assigns a score to their response. For example, 5, strongly agree. This is kind of like a Likert scale, and you'll learn more about that later. This score is a value for the variable being measured. Then the researcher marries the variables using continuous or categorical scores. Knowing this type of classification will help you understand the different types of variables that are used in purpose statements, research questions, and hypotheses. Researchers score variables by grouping them into A, designated categories, or B, by using them to represent a value of some kind on a continuum ranging from low to high levels. A, categorical measures. A variable measured in categories is a variable measured by the researcher as a small number of groups or categories. This is also known as a discrete or nominal score. For example, groups of students, males 1, females 2. Or low ability 1 and high ability 2. A continuous measure is a variable measured by the researcher on a point along a continuum of scores, from low to high scores. This is also known as an interval, a rating, or a scaled score. For example, age, from 25 years old to 65 years old. Height, from 5 feet to 6 feet tall. It can also depict how much individuals agree or disagree with an idea or may rate the importance of a given issue. A construct is an attribute or characteristic expressed in an abstract, general way, whereas a variable is an attribute or characteristic stated in a specific, applied way. For example, student achievement is a construct, and grade point average is a variable. Traditionally in research, it is common to use variables rather than constructs in purpose statements, research questions, and hypotheses, and that's what we're going to use in this class. A helpful way to think about the different type of variables is to think about them in a cause and effect relationship. What variables influence outcomes? Ask yourself the following. Number one, what outcomes in my study am I trying to explain? That's your dependent variable. Number two, what variables or factors influence the outcome? That's your independent variable. A control variable is a form of independent variable that investigators measure to eliminate a possibility. However, it is not the main variable trying to explain the dependent variable's outcome. Common examples of control variables are gender, socioeconomic status, intelligence, race, level of formal education, age, and prior knowledge to a topic. These variables are usually controlled through statistical procedures. These variables are called covariates. When we learn about these later, and they are typically statistically adjusted for their effects. However, in descriptive and correlational studies, control variables may be of primary interest. For example, consider the following research question. Does socioeconomic status predict differences in resilience for middle school students? Here, your socioeconomic status is the control variable, and it cannot be manipulated, and resilience is your dependent variable. There's going to be more on confounding variables later. So here's an illustration that shows you the family of variables and quantitative studies. A dependent variable, which is the most important, is an attribute or characteristic that is dependent on or influenced by the independent variable. You may find them labeled in the literature as the outcome, effect, criterion, or consequence variables. There are usually multiple dependent variables in a study. Dependent variables can be measured using continuous or categorical scores. For example, in education, an example of a dependent variable would be achievement scores on a test, leadership skill of a principal, or the cost effectiveness of student affair programs in colleges. Dependent variables can be located when you examine the purpose statement, research questions, and hypotheses for outcome that the researcher is trying to explain or predict. Ask yourself, what outcome am I trying to explain? An independent variable is the second in importance, is an attribute or characteristic that influences or affects an outcome or dependent variable. The independent variables influence the dependent variables through the mediating variable. Sometimes the mediating variable exists and sometimes they do not. Independent variables can be called factors, treatments, predictors, determinants, or antecedent variables. Researchers study independent variables to see what effect, think cause and effect, or influence they have on the outcome. For example, identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. Do students who spend more instructional time in class on math have higher math scores than students who spend less time? Well, your independent variable is time on the math instruction. The dependent variable is the math scores. So looking at the instructional time, which is your cause, it gives us info on the outcome of the math scores, or your effect. Treatment, measured, control, and moderating variables are different types of independent variables. A measured variable is a standard independent variable that is measured or observed and consists of a range of continuous or categorical scores. It is used in various types of studies, such as experimental, correlational, and survey research. A control variable is a variable that is important to consider and neutralize because it can potentially influence your dependent variable. A treatment variable is measured in categories to determine its effects on an outcome dependent variable, also known as manipulated variables or variables with levels. Experimental researchers refer to these groups as levels. A moderating variable are new variables constructed by the researcher by taking one variable times another to determine the joint impact of both variables together. The impact is called an interaction effect. These three forms of independent variables in quantitative research serve a slightly different purpose. Look at the use in row. Mediating variables is an attribute or characteristic that stands between the independent and dependent variables and exercises an influence on the dependent variable apart from the independent variable. Mediating variables transmit or mediate the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. In some quantitative studies, mediating variables are controlled using statistical procedures. Here's a flowchart looking at the mediating variables and how they stand between independent and dependent variables. Confounding variables, also called spurious variables, are attributes or characteristics that the researcher cannot directly measure because their effects cannot be easily separated from those of other variables. Even though they may influence the relation between the independent and dependent variable, if you can measure a confounding variable, well, then it becomes a control variable and we can statistically control for it. Testing variables in quantitative research is important. The first step is to describe our variables by reporting such things as the mean and variability. The next step is to compare two groups and test whether the means for the two groups are different. Third, we seek to test whether the independent variable influences the outcome or the dependent variable to establish a likely cause and effect relationship. Lastly, you seek to test a theory because a theory predicts the likely impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable. Theory in quantitative research explains and predicts the probable relationship between independent and dependent variables. Here is a chart that depicts the different types of explanations in quantitative research. When the background knowledge of variables in theory that we have gained, we are now ready to discuss quantitative purpose statement, research questions, and hypothesis. Quantitative purpose statements identify the variables, their relationship, and the participants and site for research. Here are some guidelines. Number 1, write the purpose statement in a single sentence. Number 2, start your sentence with the purpose of the study. Number 3, if you plan to use a theory, state it in your sentence by stating, test a theory. Number 4, use words like relate, compare, describe to indicate whether variables will be related, groups will be compared, or variables will be described. Number 5, when comparing, specify the independent, dependent, and any other variables. Purpose statement continued, so now we state the independent variable first in the sentence, followed by the dependent variable second in the sentence. And the control and mediating variables, if used, state them lastly, third in the sentence. You identify the participants to be studied and the research site where they will also be studied. Here's a way that you can design your purpose statement, so you can follow the script to help you do that. Because research questions narrow and focus the purpose statement, they serve to restate the purpose and specific questions that the researcher seeks to answer. Research questions describe the participant's reaction to a single variable, compare groups on an outcome, or relate to variables. They are found in all types of quantitative research studies, such as in experiments, correlational surveys, and correlational studies and surveys. The basic steps in forming a research question are the following. Number 1, pose a question. Number 2, begin with how, what, or why. Number 3, specify the independent, dependent, and other variables. Number 4, use words like describe, compare, relate to indicate the action or connection among the variables. 5th, indicate the participants in the research site for the study. Researchers use descriptive question to identify participants' responses to a single variable or question. This single variable may be an independent variable, dependent variable, or a mediating variable. Relationship questions seek to answer the degree and magnitude of the relationship between two or more variables. Comparison questions seek to find out how two or more groups on an independent variable differ in terms of one or more outcome variables. Experiments use comparison questions, and in these studies, the researcher provides some intervention to one group and withhold it from a second group. Just like research questions, the hypothesis narrows the purpose statement in quantitative research. But hypotheses advance a prediction about the investigator expects to find. Researchers make at least one hypothesis to predict the outcome of the study. For example, the more students feel alienated, the more likely they are to carry weapons to school. Here are guidelines when writing your hypothesis. Number one, state the variables in this order: independent variable, dependent variable, control variable. Number two, if you are comparing groups in your hypothesis, state the groups. If variables are related, state the relationship of the variables specifically. Number three, make a prediction about the changes you expect to get out of your groups, such as less or more than, favorable or no changes, etc. Then you will test this prediction using statistical procedures. Number four, give information about the site and participants, but if stated in purpose statement, then it just might not be necessary. There are two types of hypothesis: null and alternative to the null. You need both types in a research study, but researchers generally only write one in the report. You can see the purpose of each type in the chart above. A null hypothesis is the most common way to write a hypothesis. A null hypothesis makes a prediction that there is no change on the dependent variable because there's no difference between the relationship or groups of the independent and dependent variables. For example, there will be no significant difference in test scores between fifth grade boys and girls on the STAR achievement test. A directional alternative hypothesis: the researcher will predict the direction of change, a difference, or a relationship for variables. For example, fifth grade girls will have higher scores on the STAR achievement test than fifth grade boys. A non-directional alternative hypothesis: the researcher predicts the change, difference, or relationship for the variables, but does not indicate the change will be a positive, negative, or greater or less. For example, there will be a difference in test scores on the STAR achievement test for fifth grade boys and girls. Yay! Okay, so now we're in qualitative. Before we learn how to write qualitative purpose statements and research questions, we need to understand how qualitative and quantitative research are similar and different. Here's how the purpose statements and research questions in qualitative is different or similar to quantitative. Number one, quantitative hypotheses are used and they're not used in qualitative studies. Number two, quantitative researchers use the term variables while qualitative researchers do not use variables, but instead they gather information on a single concept and they call these a central phenomenon. Number three, quantitative research tests theories, but qualitative research builds general themes on ideas shared by participants. Number four, quantitative research uses a closed-ended stance by identifying variables and select instruments to collect data before the study begins. Qualitative researchers use an open-ended stance and often change the phenomenon being studied or lets it emerge. Quantitative is more deductive, making qualitative more inductive. Number five, quantitative research measures differences among groups. Qualitative research doesn't compare groups but seeks to get a deeper understanding of the views of one group or single individuals. The central phenomenon in qualitative research is the concept or process explored in qualitative research. For example, ethnic identity of Chinese American immigrants, or the process of negotiation by female superintendent with her principals. Here is how researchers explain or predict variables versus exploring or understanding a central phenomenon. An emerging process indicates that the intent or purpose of a study and the questions asked by the researcher may change during the process of inquiry, but the based on feedback or responses from participants. Questions and purposes may change because the investigator allows the participants to set the direction, and thus learns from the participant's view rather than imposing his or her view on the researcher's situation. Here, the researcher begins with the general question. The researcher then focuses direction by asking questions that are more detailed. Then, in-depth questioning occurs. The questions change as the researcher delves deeper into the central phenomenon. A purpose statement in qualitative research indicates the intent to explore or understand the central phenomenon with specific individuals at a certain research site. It is written as a single sentence and usually located at the end of the introduction. Here are examples of how you can write a qualitative purpose statement. Qualitative research questions are open-ended, general questions that the researcher would like answered during the study. Guidelines for writing your research questions. Number 1. The questions will change and emerge during the study based on participants' views of the central phenomenon and your deeper understanding of it. Number 2. Ask only a few general questions. 5 to 7 is enough. Number 3. Ask questions that use neutral exploratory language. Use verbs like generate, discover, understand, describe, and explore. Number 4, create and write 2 types of qualitative research questions, central questions and sub-questions. The central question is the overarching question you explore in a research study. Follow these strategies when creating your central question. Number 1, begin with words how or what instead of why. Number 2, state the central phenomenon you plan to explore. Number 3, identify the participants in the study. Number 4, mention the research site for the study. Notice here that the creativity is the central phenomenon, and the participants are 5 students, and the location is Roosevelt High School, and they started their sentence with the word what. These examples indicate central questions stated in terms that are too general, too focused, or too laden with assumptions. It shows a poor example and then a better example. In addition to a central question, qualitative researchers often pose sub-questions. Sub-questions refine the central question into sub-questions to be addressed in the research. They provide greater specifics to the questions in the study. Issue sub-questions narrow the focus of the central question into specific questions. Procedural sub-questions indicate steps to be used in analyzing the data in a qualitative study. Here's different examples of issue sub-questions and procedural sub-questions. The core questions you might ask be the issue sub-questions in your study. You should ask your participants about themselves as your opening question. And you should close with asking them to suggest individuals with whom you might visit to gather additional data from. Quantitative example with purpose statement and guiding research questions in this one paragraph. Followed by a qualitative research question that is open-ended and a qualitative purpose statement example. And that concludes Chapter 4.